other one thing that I want to point out about discussion boards this week is that um, many of you have not yet made an initial discussion board post. It was due on Monday, which was a holiday. That was a mistake on my part. I didn't realize until Tuesday, and I figured I would address it when we meet today. So basically, if you have not yet posted your initial post for the discussion board, do that by the deadline for the response post, and I'll be happy to accept it for this week. All right, for future weeks, if that happens, if you miss the initial post or you post it late, I don't accept late work, so you would just get, the points off. You'd get a 0 on that initial post part. You would still get some posts for the response posts, though. Okay, so just kind of keep that in mind as you're working through. All right, so I know there were a few videos that went out last week, some things about your the start of your research project. Before we dive into the readings for today, is there anything you wanted to ask about? Any questions that you might have, maybe about the class in general, or about the research project, or even these readings, Blackboard, anything? All right, so it sounds like no questions. If a question does come up, post it or interrupt me if you want to use your mic, and I'll be happy to address it right in that moment. Okay, so let's take a look at our first source here. So we've got Journal of the First Voyage of Columbus. What did you think about it, just sort of holistically? What was your impression? Okay, an impression was how unfair it was toward the natives. Okay, absolutely, absolutely. Gypsy, you said you'll be honest, you haven't gotten to reading them yet. Okay, so thank you for being honest. That's fabulous. When we have these class sessions, we're mainly going to be discussing the reading, so you want to have at least a cursory read through before you join us. That's not to say that if you haven't had the chance, you should not. I definitely still agree that you should. But just have kind of an understand, like a working understanding at the least, right? But thank you again for being honest, Gypsy. I appreciate that. But yeah, Michelle, absolutely. I think that that's a fair impression to get. How unfair Christopher Columbus behaved toward the Native Americans. And when you say unfair, what do you mean by unfair? Okay, so unfair being that the natives had no idea of the colonizers' true schemes and that their kindness was really kind of fake. Yeah, absolutely. And how do we see that in the readings? Maybe like what's one example that you guys happen to notice? What is this kindness that you put in air quotes, Michelle? But except I'm gonna open that to everyone. Okay, when they give gifts to the natives as a sort of peace sign, but they did it to ultimately win their trust to gain land. Yeah, absolutely. No, I totally got where you're going with that. So yeah, I mean, that's exactly. And a really good example is just right on like the first page of the document, right? We see that Christopher Columbus sent for the man in the canoe, right? That comes up to the ship, gives him a red cap. This is right at the top of the second column. He gave him a red cap, some small beads of green glass, which I put on his arms, and small bells, which I put in his ears, and ordered his canoe, which was also on board, to be returned to him. Then he sends him to shore, and a little bit further down, all the others came round him and seemed astonished, for it seemed clear to them that we were good people, right? And how does this impression of kindness, how does that contradict maybe actions that were taken earlier? Yeah, absolutely. So you say the fact that they somewhat kidnapped the natives, I would push back on that a little bit and take out the somewhat. I would just say they straight up kidnapped the natives, right? Because we see it in that first column. The first time this is mentioned, as the people I had taken from the island of San Salvador, like a really nonchalant, like, I did this thing, but it's not a big deal because it's what we do, right? So that I had taken, also see, even at the beginning in their conversation with the man that they gave the gifts to, um, sailors jumped into the sea because he would not come on board the caravel and seized him. Right. So even if they don't maintain possession, the body of the natives is something to be possessed, uh, from the reading that we see here and from how Columbus interacts with them. But so there's no somewhat kidnapping, there's just straight up kidnapping. And we see that again in Cabeza de Vaca's piece, as he's, taking them to use as guides, right? So that same idea. Yeah, and like why would Columbus want to appear to be kind? What would be the point of that? Right? What's the reason that he gives? Okay, to gain their trust? Sure, sure, that's part of it. Um, and what is that trust for? Is it trust for himself? Is it for someone else? He gives himself away at the end of the first journal entry, if that helps. Okay, that's okay. That happens sometimes. What about the rest of you guys? Because Michelle's been doing a lot of work here. So, Gypsy, I know you haven't had the chance to read yet. Is it to find the gold? Okay, yeah, I think that that's a really good assumption, right? Because that's his whole purpose. He is there to find gold. And so, that kind of underlies everything. Now, he doesn't have any misperception that he's going to, strike gold this first time around, right? He's basically a scouting mission. I mean, is he looking for gold? Yeah, totally. He's following the leads to try to find it. But he knows that he's not going to be um, the only sailing vessel that comes. And so what he does is he is basically like trying to make things nicer for future, sailing trips who are looking to find gold, looking to find land, looking to find whatever may come up in the future as the thing to go get in this new land, right? And we can see that right at the end of that first journal entry from the 15th of October. He says, talking about um, he's talking about a man that had come alongside the ship, and he had him come aboard and brought his canoe on board and took his property and things like that. And he says, I ordered him to be given to eat bread and treacle and also to drink, right? So they're kind of giving him all these nice stuff. It's kind of like the dude with the beads and stuff like that, right? They're just treating him well. I shall take him on to Fernandina, where I shall return everything to him in order that he may give a good account of us, right? So he's like, okay, if I treat this guy well, he's going to say nice things about us to other people. At our Lord pleasing, when your highness shall send here those who may come receive your honor, and the natives may give them all they require, right? So he is very aware that he's not going to be the only vessel coming through here, but what he's thinking is, okay, I need to prepare for the future. That's why I'm here. Future trips, right? So you always want to think whenever, whether it is a historical individual or character, you want to be thinking, okay, they've just done something. What's the motivation there? Why did they choose to do that? In this case, since he's acting on behalf of the king, he really needs to make sure that anyone else that the king sends is going to have a warm reception. So that's the big goal there. Um, Now, in the journal entry from the 27th of November, there's a point where, I guess, middle of the second column there, it says, the Indians made as if they would resist the landing, right? Because they wanted to go, Columbus's men wanted to go on shore. They made as if they would resist the landing, but seeing that the boats of the Spaniards continued to advance without fear, they retired from the beach. So they left. Why would the Native Americans, right? And if you read the next sentence, we find out there's only three people from Columbus's ship that's going to the land. So if there's three people coming toward the shore, Why are all of these Native Americans choosing to run rather than stay and welcome, for example? All right, so they don't know if they are enemy or foe, and they don't know if they are stronger than themselves. Absolutely, right? Look from the Native American perspective, well, actually, either of them, really, right? From the Lenni Lenape tribe or the Yuki tribe that we had to read for this week, you can see that they have no idea these people, like who they're dealing with. Um, Gypsy, you say maybe from past experience with other foreigners, possibly. There isn't really much indication that they've interacted with people from other areas, like groups of people that they really weren't aware of and have like relationships with. Doesn't mean that's not the case, right? So it could be either of those things, right? They are concerned, about how this will affect them, right? First thing you do, um, you have someone that you don't know walk up your driveway and come ring your doorbell. Your first thought, uh, in 2022 probably isn't, oh, maybe I should invite them in for lunch. It's probably, what are you doing on my property? Why are you here to see me? I wasn't expecting you, right? And so that kind of protectionist thinking, it's all about maintaining life and self. So yeah, I think that, you know, Gypsy, you may be correct. If there were past experiences before, there's not too much on record, but it doesn't mean it didn't happen. And then Michelle, absolutely, you don't know. They're just not aware of the capabilities of these, men coming off of the boat. Just don't know. So absolutely. Now we see one more thing that I want to talk about here. Um, the type of language that is used in this. It doesn't happen often this week, but I really want you to keep an eye out in the readings next week. Um, like dehumanizing language, right? On the first page of the document here in the Monday, 15th of October section, the end of the first column, we see that some of my people went on shore in chase of them, right? So for, going on shore to get some Native Americans, essentially, to kidnap them, like we were talking about before, but they all fled like fowls, right? Now, this is probably the most relaxed way you'll see this used, but calling them fowls and saying that they fled like fowls, right? What does that mean, and why is that dehumanizing? Well, maybe we should start off with what is a fowl? Fowl. What is fowl? Yeah, it's a bird. And Rossi, you say, or Rosie, I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce your name. I apologize if I get it wrong. Fowl is another word for chicken, right? So he's referring to them as animals. Absolutely, right. So we've got a bird, and a fowl. It doesn't necessarily need to be a chicken, right? But it's basically a game bird, bird that's just from our way of thinking, meant to be hunted, whether by people or by, other animals, something like that. Right. And so, yeah, absolutely. Calling, another person an animal, right, is always going to be dehumanizing. Um, and the fact that this is in conjunction with trying to escape from being captured, what impact does that make on the dehumanization? Or does it? What was the question? The question was, does that have any impact? No, you're good. Anytime you're unsure, ask me to rephrase. Sometimes I'm thinking as I'm speaking and it comes out a little jumbly. So yeah, so what does the fact that they are running away to try to stop from being captured and then being called a foul, like what conclusion can you draw from that? He doesn't really care about them. Accurate, right? That is absolutely true. His kindness is all an act. It absolutely is. But let's think about it in this specific setting, right? So, what is it that people let's see, Michelle, you've just said something. So they're no longer referring to them as even humans because they are no longer human in the colonizers' minds. They can do anything, or that the natives have no feelings. I think that's absolutely a fair assessment, for sure. Um, Now, the thing that I want to, kind of focus on here, and Michelle, you touch on it just a little bit, right, is that these Native Americans are running away from being captured, right, and being forced to do, who knows what. And they're comparing them almost in a mocking way to foul, right? So freedom, or escaping and like running away and preserving your way of life as you know it, right? I mean, those are two options. Like, I'm a foul any day. I don't know. Like, what I'm saying is essentially they're dehumanizing the Native Americans for doing something that I would say most people in that situation would do, right? So it's an interesting dynamic in that, what do they think that they would just allow themselves to be captured if a big, ship from another nation came to try to get hold of theirs? No, they would fight or they would run. Those would be the options. Um, yeah, so I just wanted to kind of point that out, especially in the context that the readings for next week have a lot of um, like derogatory name calling, in terms of, like, there's a lot of the word savage being used and things like that. So I just wanted to kind of make you aware that while this is obviously dehumanizing on its own, right? Something that sounds as not as intense, right? Like calling someone a foul, um, still suggests that same kind of sentiment. All right, so let's move on to the um, narrative of the expedition of Coronado, right? So we have Cabeza de Vaca is um, another explorer. Okay, this is actually published in Jameson J. Franklin's book, uh, Original Narratives of Early American History. Okay, so if you were to cite this, it would be cited as Franklin, and then whichever page number the information is on in your in-text citation. Now, the first thing that I want to ask you is, how hard is life for these men, from what we see in here? Is this new world like really welcoming, or does it pose a challenge? It does. It definitely poses a challenge to them. Life is harder, for sure. Absolutely. You guys are totally right. How do we know life is harder? Like, what's their struggle? What are they, pushing up against? Okay. Michelle, you say they're always watching their backs to not get shot by arrows and spears from the natives. For sure, that does happen on occasion. Um, Usually after some sort of provocation, I would argue. But yeah, that's definitely a worry, right? They don't know, where something like that could come from, because guess who knows the land better? Not them. They just got there, right? And the fact that they don't have enough food, all right? That is the biggest one, okay? They don't have enough provisions. So we find out that, they had 40 men. This is on page 25, right at the beginning. I guess about halfway through that first paragraph. They traveled on the allowance they had received 15 days without finding any other to eat than palmitos. Um, Right. And so in that time, they saw not an Indian and found neither village nor house. Right. They were going through this new land that they were unfamiliar with. They did have some kind of food to eat, but like, it was one kind of food, and that wouldn't satisfy their nutritional needs. So this is a concern. What is the fact that they saw not an Indian and found neither village nor house suggest about the area that they're in? As I said, there's no people, no village, no house. It's a place where crops maybe didn't grow well enough to grow and live in. Yeah, Absolutely, right? There's obviously some sort of issue. If this were a fertile area, people would be living here. Okay. Just like we saw later on when they found the bay, right? And they had to follow the little hidden stream to get up into the valley. They saw that it was really fertile and there was like tons of smoke coming out of there. They knew that that was a large settlement. Part of that is that we've got, actually, that might have been from Columbus. I'm trying to recall. But either way, right? That obviously was land that was able to support people living on it, right? You don't build a town where you can't survive. It's not worth using the resources and spending the energy. Okay, so we find out right away that wherever it is that they landed, um, which probably is like northern Florida, from doing a little bit of digging, probably northern Florida, maybe. No, it's not even as high as Georgia. So like in Florida, there just wasn't enough resources for them to survive. There just wasn't. Okay. And of course, as they move through, they find better resources, more access to things, but things become more dangerous, not just from Native Americans, but also from what? What other things in the land became dangerous for them? Sickness? Okay. Yeah, there was some sickness that was happening for sure, and that, of course, caused major issues in the camps. There were also some other environmental things too. Anything stand out to you as you were reading? What about this page 27? This is when they are talking about let's see, right after the man and his horse were drowned. Okay. We see that there was um, many of the standing trees. This is right at the bottom of page 27. Many of the standing trees were riven from top to bottom by bolts of lightning, which fall in that country of frequent storms and tempests. Right. We also see um, description of bad passages, woods and lakes that blocked access to things. There was also a discussion of downed logs that were covering paths and things like that that made it difficult to travel. So why are all of these things impediments to these men being able to explore this new world? Why don't you just climb over it and get over it? Okay, it slows them down, which then compounds their issues with what? Exactly, right? Finding more food and water. If you're down and you're trying to, get over all of these blockades and all of these obstacles so that you can get to a place that has better food and water, and you keep, having to stop, like you're going to run out of food and water and you can't find it, right? And as you said earlier, there's always that threat of, oh, there someone around who may be hostile, right? Because we know from page from page 26 that Cabeza de Vaca and his men had also taken Native Americans to use as guides. I don't know about you, but if someone in my family got kidnapped, I, might be a little hostile about it, and I would try to get them back, right? So there's always that concern that maybe will come and maybe they will attack, which of course they do after they, after these people on the expedition take back cacique. What page is that on? Page 30, right? So this is when they get to Appalachian, right? Because remember at the beginning, they meet with, oh gosh, what was his name? The Native American chief. It started with a D. Um, okay, I don't want to waste your time. Um, they met with this chief and they kind of figured an enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing, right? And so they were wanting to go to Appalachian, the Spanish, right? So the Cabeza de Vaca and his guys, they wanted to go to Appalachian, and this chief was like, "Yeah, we don't like them," and he was like, "Cool, why don't right?" And then, of course, that caused some issues later on. But we see they get to Appalachian, we get a description, and then there were only women and children in the town, okay? And so, naturally, because this is what we've seen, at least from these two pieces, that, explorers do, they take the women and children, they hold them hostage, and let's see, on page 30, it's that first full paragraph. 2 hours after our arrival at Appalachian, the Indians who had fled from there came in peace to us, asking for their women and children, whom we released. But the detention of a cacique, right? So uh, they kept a cacique imprisoned. And cacique again is a king or a prince by the governor, produced great excitement. In consequence of which they returned for battle early the next day and attacked us with such promptness and alacrity that they succeeded in setting fire to the houses in which we were. Right, so this isn't child's play, right? These war games are real games. No, that was not what I meant to say. These war games are real war, right? They have the potential of getting hurt on both sides. Um, and so we have that constant threat, like Michelle was saying earlier, of retribution. So that's a big thing to also keep in mind here. And again, we also see, um, that this was a very thinly peopled region, right? Appalachian, that term is still in use, right? It's the mountains that run up like the whole eastern coast of the United States. But we see that at the time, it was thinly peopled and difficult to travel for the bad passages, the woods, and the lakes, right? And people were less numerous and poor, the land little occupied, and the inhabitants much scattered. All right. Again, suggesting a struggle to find food, shelter, um, these things that people need to survive. Okay, so we saw conflict in the Devakis piece about about how these explorers were constantly being pitted against the natural world, okay, about how they were pitted against the Native Americans largely because they provoked some sort of issue with them, right, by kidnapping people, having them serve as guards, detaining them in other ways. Um, so we see that here as well. I want to ask, did you see a difference between Christopher Columbus's piece and Cabeza de Vaca's, or did it seem very consistent to you guys? Even if you didn't have the chance to read it yourself, from what we've just talked about, does it seem consistent, or did they seem to kind of have a varied, um, approach or interest in what they're trying to convey? Oh, consistent and similar. Okay, that's fair. Does anyone disagree and say that they're a little bit different? No? Okay. So I agree that they are consistent and similar, right? We have some things, the way they treat. Oh, Gypsy, you say I can see some differences in the way they describe each one. Okay, excellent. Each one what though? What do you mean by each one? I'm not quite sure. Or do you mean the piece in general? Okay, cool. So yeah, I would say there are some similar themes, right? The ways that they interact with Native Americans, the kind of dehumanizing factor, um, the expectation that they are, these explorers are entitled to land. I mean, for Pete's sake, Christopher Columbus decides to name things that I'm sure already had names, right? You can't get much more egotistical than that. But there are differences too, right? There's a lot more maybe description in terms of like boots on the ground comparison between Spain and North America in Cabeza de Vaca's work, whereas in Columbus's, it was very much in relation to, okay, like how do these descriptions, how does this natural world around me, um, you know, how do I interact with it? Can I move my ship over there? Right? I can. What could I accomplish by doing that? Right? So it's very methodical, whereas Cabeza de Vaca seems to be a little bit more just descriptive for the sake of being descriptive. Um, Obviously, that's just my interpretation. But, uh, you know, if you have another one that you'd like to put out there, please feel free. Um, Shoot over to talking about the Lenni Lenape oral tradition, right? So this one's titled "The Indian Account of the First Arrival of the Dutch at New York Island." Um, what we have going on here? What stands out to you about this one? This is the Native American piece that's longer. If that kind of helps you separate it in your mind. Ah, all right. Maybe you haven't gotten to it yet. Um, but I mean, really, so first off, okay, since we didn't have anyone jump into the ring for that one, let's kind of set the scene a little bit here. We kind of talked about where Cabeza de Vaca was hanging out. We didn't talk about where Columbus was, but I think it's pretty well known that he was in the Bahamas, like he never made it to present day United States. Um, the Lenape tribe were on the banks of the Hudson River in New York. Okay, this is like north of New York City. I want to say it runs like 100 miles or so up to Albany, right? It goes beyond there, but like that's like the big part of the river, and that's where the Mohican tribe also lived, right? So you've got that whole little strip between the Hudson River and Connecticut, and then the other side toward the Catskills Mountains and things like that. Um, so we have this like very fertile area in which they live, right? This is a good spot to grow crops. These days, it's a good spot to put highways to drive down to New York City, but it is fertile land at some point. Um, and so, we have this description. Kind of when we put it there, we realize that we are talking about the Dutch. We're not talking about, like we have this maybe presupposition, or maybe this is because I went to school in the late 90s and that was all they talked about. The English and the Puritans, right? And the Spanish, who, gosh, I can't think of the word, but who sent Cabeza de Vaca and who sent Columbus. Um, you know, they didn't really talk about the Dutch. And I grew up in New York, right? So I'm like, why didn't we talk about this? So you not realize that there was a huge Dutch influence in the early United States before it became the United States, of course. Now, that just gives you some context here. And the thing that's interesting about this is uh, the Lenape tribe actually thought that these Dutchmen who were coming on the ships were their god. Okay, they couldn't figure out what was happening on this ship, right? They actually had a dispute. They couldn't figure out if, and this is on page 1, it was an uncommonly large fish or animal, if it was a very big house floating on the sea, but they did know that it was a wonderful object and it was moving toward land. Okay, Um, they also thought that it could be an animal or something else that had life in it. What does this tell you? What do these descriptions of the ship tell you? Okay, it's fast. It could be. It could be. Um, Gypsy, you say they had never seen one before. I would say that's probably the most accurate, right? I mean, if you had seen, like they obviously have canoes, or some other small boats, but the boats that would take to weather from, Europe and get to North America through those storms in the Atlantic, they have to be pretty intense, right? And there really wasn't much interaction prior to this point, right? Because this is the first arrival of the Dutch at New York Island. Okay, so we have um, this new and different description, just because there's no frame of reference here. They've seen seafaring vessels, but they've not been like deep water seafaring. Um, so yeah, absolutely. And then what happens? They figure out that there's, um, you know, people essentially. On page 2, they concluded it to be a remarkably large house in which the Manito, the great or supreme being himself, was present, and that he probably was coming to visit them. Okay, hang tight. Why would the Benito be coming to visit these Native Americans in on the Hudson River? Why would he be coming to visit them? Why would they think that? Michelle, they were probably waiting for him or for a sign that what they were doing for him was right and pleasing. Yeah, absolutely. Right? They see this new thing that is completely out of the realm of their understanding. Right? They can't even agree on what it could possibly be. And they just assume that it is their God. And now they have to work hard to make sure that he realizes how much they respect and appreciate him. They want to have, on page 2, they start talking about preparing the best victuals, right? They're going to make the best food. They're going to have a grand dance. There's going to be a sacrifice meant to appease him if he was angry with them. Um, you know, there's a council that's set up made of chiefs and wise men for advice and protection from the tribe, right? How do we deal with this situation? Now, why were people nervous? Why did they need protection? Like, if this is God, why wasn't the assumption that he would be pleased to see them and that they would, be happily accepted for who they are? Okay, might have been doing some things they knew were wrong. That's totally possible. I mean, as humans, we do that all the time. You push the envelope, right? The teachings say that you can stop here and, maybe you stop there, right? Just a little bit further than what you should do. Yeah, that's entirely possible. It could all even just be the expectation that maybe they somehow made him angry and that's why he's just appeared, right? They've never seen him before. So he's there for a reason. Whether that's because, they think that maybe he busted them doing things incorrectly. Maybe it's just because it's so out of the ordinary. It must be because of something terrible. Uh, Ultimately, that doesn't matter. The truth of the matter is that he comes down, or from from the Netherlands, and he is obviously not the Manito, right? He is not the god. But does the fact that the Lenni Lenape tribe think he's the Manito, does that play into the favor of the Dutchman? Yeah. Yeah, Gypsy, absolutely. They treat him with respect and not even just respect, right? It's almost like deference, right? I mean, he is a god in their mind. Michelle, you say yes, of course. If they didn't assume it was their god, instead of being kind and welcoming, they may have seen them and been hostile toward them. Absolutely, right? So, this idea of respect or kindness that the Lenni Lenape tribe used their interaction with the I guess we can call him the captain. We don't know any better, right? The guy in red, and others around him thinking that they're his attendants. Um, they may not have been able to have the same types of interactions. They might not have been able to, pass around a cup of liquor and get some of the Native Americans drunk. They might not have been able to ask for land and been able to trick them into giving a lot instead of a little, right? This is something that they are, or they need to be respectful and deferential to the Manito, right? Puts Dutch at a huge advantage here. Whatever they want, if it's humanly possible, the Lenni Lenape tribe is going to give it to him, right? So, we see the situation here. Let's see, where exactly? It's on page 5. About halfway down, as the whites became daily more familiar with the Indians, they at last proposed to stay with them and asked only for so much ground for a garden spot as, they said, the hide of a bullock would cover or encompass, which hide was spread before them. So they took out a hide and said, you know what, we just need this much, ground, right? We want this much for a little garden, that way we can have some veggies and stuff. Um, well, spices, but same thing. And once they were like, yeah, sure, dude, take the land. That's fine. That's not that much. I'm cool with it. They took this, this hide, and they actually cut to make it into like a rope. So it's really long now, right? And then what they did was they made that into a big circle, and that became their garden. Do you think? Oh my gosh, what does that tell you about the way that the Dutch were interacting with the Lenni Lenape tribe? Are they just like Columbus and Cabeza de Vaca? Are they still different because they didn't seem to take hostages? Like, what's going on here? They assumed that they knew no better and they took advantage of the situation, full force for their own gain, essentially no better than Columbus. Yeah, I mean, that is essentially what happened. And then we get this. I know that it's 1 o'clock, like on the nose. I just want to say this one last thing, and then we'll wrap up. Um, it's obvious that the person who wrote this down kind of shared the same mindset as well. On page 5, we have the sentence, the Indians were surprised at the superior wit of the whites, but did not wish to contend with them about a little land as they still had enough themselves. The superior wit of the whites, I don't know about you, that would not be the way I described getting like hoodwinked and manipulated, especially when I was willing to share. I mean, I'm just saying. So, I do agree that, he's very similar to, the Dutch are very similar to Columbus in that way in terms of, having very high expectations that couldn't possibly be met in an equal um, power dynamic, I guess. All right, so it is 101. I'm so sorry for taking up an extra minute, but we went through 3 of the 4 readings, which is fabulous. The only one that we didn't was the little guy, Creation of the Whites. So make sure that you do read that if you haven't yet had the opportunity. Don't forget to do the discussion board. Remember, if you have not yet done the initial post of your discussion board this week, I will allow you to post that and get credit for that by the deadline for the response post. So basically this week, just get it in by that deadline. Next week, I'm going to hold you to the initial post deadline and the response post deadlines. All right, so if anyone has any questions, hang back. We can talk about it. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day, and I will see you next Wednesday. See ya.